evolution of the automobile in America is a complicated thing, and this is an oversimplified, generalized overview. This is not a look at the most common or most popular cars through the years, or even the average car exactly, but more of the very middle of the market for price, size, and options among cars sold in America. Something hard to determine in the early years with such a wide variety of automobiles, in a huge range of sizes from cycle cars to high-wheelers, with a variety of gas, steam, and electric power sources. Even tracking all the manufacturers at this time is nearly impossible. But by the mid-1910s, the industry was starting to normalize, and not all cars were being considered as luxury items. Although twin and single-cylinder cars were still being offered, high-end cars were expanding to 8 cylinders and soon beyond. But the flathead inline 4-cylinder was the mainstream offering, with the medium engine size quickly climbing to near 240 cubic inches, or about 4 liters, and horsepower was in the low 30s. Wheelbase would be just over 110 inches and length around 170 inches, and weight around 2,800 pounds, with prices nearing $2,000, or more than twice the cost of a Model T at the time. Cars would continue to grow into the 1920s, with 6 cylinders becoming the norm, but prices would come down to around $1,800. Wheelbase would be over 115 inches and length over 190, width more than 70 inches, and weight over 3,200 pounds. In spite of the additional cylinders, engines were only slightly bigger, around 250 cubic inches, or 4.1 liters, but horsepower would be up to around 55. This is compared to smaller entry-level cars like the Model T, with its 2.9-liter 4 with 22 horsepower, and its starting price having dropped as low as $260. The middle-of-the-road-sized car in America by the late 1920s was about the same size as a modern luxury sedan, with wheelbase around 120 inches, length just over 200 inches, and width near 75 inches. Of course, with height closer to 70 inches, that would make it a large SUV by modern standards. The engine would be a straight 6 of about 255 cubic inches, or 4.2 liters, with roughly 75 horsepower. A flathead, naturally, and prices would be in the realm of $1,200. By 1930, wheelbase was over 120 inches and length close to 205, and the typical height was about 5'7", with weight close to 3,600 pounds. Features had increased, such as standard bumpers, grille, and glass door windows. The straight 8 was now the typical engine offering at around 270 cubic inches, or 4.4 liters, and 100 horsepower. Prices were back up to around $1,700, and most manufacturers were claiming mileage in the mid to high teens. But the Great Depression meant getting more for less, and by mid-decade, wheelbases had climbed a couple of inches, overall length a half a dozen inches, while median prices were back down closer to $1,200, and the average purchase price was closer to $800. Engines were smaller at around 250 cubic inches, but horsepower was up to around 110. Weight was down a couple hundred pounds as well, mostly due to the disappearance of premium models, which also accounted for some of the decline in prices. A trend that carried into the pre-war era, as cars got slightly smaller, typically 3 or 4 inches in both length and wheelbase, and an inch or 2 in height, while gaining close to 4 inches in width. Weight was down a couple of hundred pounds more, and although engine sizes didn't change, horsepower was down about 10, as the more advanced engines tended to belong to companies that failed, and prices would drop below $900. After World War II, the industry would have a bit of a reboot, and in spite of a high volume of carryover product, prices would be up significantly, typically $400 or $500 more than when production stopped during the war, coming in at around $1,500. 6s were once again more common than 8s, although engine sizes remained about the same, and output was up to nearly 115 horsepower. Bodies were still getting wider, and weight was climbing again, back up to near 3,400 pounds. Companies would be rushing to introduce new products. New styling would produce cars that were slightly longer and slightly lower. Weight would still be climbing, once again 3,500 pounds, and flatheads would be falling from favor, with minor increases in engine size and power. now close to 260 cubic inches, or 4.3 liters, with horsepower over 120. People were, however, choosing to spend more to get more options, such as those newfangled automatic transmissions, meaning that mean and median prices would be closer than usual, with the later coming close to $2,300. The trend continued as cars got longer, lower, and heavier, with a length of about 203 inches, height below 60 inches, and weight just below 3,600 pounds, while wheelbase was down slightly to roughly 120, and prices neared $3,000. Engines continued to grow, with the overhead valve V8 becoming the norm by 1955, and median size was about 280 cubic inches, or 4.6 liters, and output was up to about 195. Long and low with tail fins was the trend in the late 50s, and engines would continue to get bigger, but there was a shift in the opposite direction around 1960 due to the growing compact market. While a big standard was around 216 inches long on a 123-inch wheelbase, a compact was about 40 inches shorter on a wheelbase 15 inches shorter. Big cars were more common, however, putting the median at a still rather large 205 inches long on a 118-inch wheelbase, while height was now under 55 inches. Most cars had a base straight 6 and a top optional V8 in sizes typically at least as large as 6.4 liters. But the norm would have been about 330 cubic inches, or 5.5 liters, nearing 275 gross horsepower, while weight and pricing would be held steady. Mid-size cars in the mid-60s would bring averages down further, with length and wheelbase down an inch or two, and weight down about 100 pounds. Engine sizes would climb above 360 cubic inches to around 6 liters, and horsepower above 320 gross, numbers that were skewered a bit by the new muscle car and pony car markets, and prices had crept above $3,000. At the peak of the muscle car era, bodies got about 3 inches longer on unchanged wheelbases. Height was down another inch, and weight up 200 pounds to roughly 3,600, with Cadillac offering V8s ranging in size from 470 cubic inches, or 7.7 liters, to as big as 500 cubic inches, or 8.2 liters. The median engine size was up to 6.2 liters and 340 gross horsepower, or 375 cubic inches and 225 net horsepower, while average output was closer to 160 horsepower net, and prices had leapt to over $3,600. The mid-70s would see some of the biggest American cars ever, but it would also see expansion of the compact market as well as the smaller subcompact market, which had things shrinking quickly, except for prices, which would be over $4,800 by the mid-70s. Wheelbase would drop below 110 inches, length 195, and width down 3 inches to around 72. The V8 was still the norm, but down to around 315 cubic inches, or 5.2 liters, with about 160 horsepower net, with mileage in the high teens. Downsizing and a growing import market would see huge declines continue, while high inflation rates saw the median price rise to over $5,600. By the early 80s, wheelbases were down to around 103 inches, with overall length around 185, and width under 70, bumping weight down to just above 2,800 pounds. 6 cylinders were the middle ground in both straight and V configurations, coming in around 212 cubic inches, or 3.5 liters, with 120 horsepower, while mileage crept into the low 20s. Prices would soon triple as cars continued to get smaller, over $15,000 for 180 inches on a 102-inch wheelbase, and a 3-liter 6 powering the front wheels. But at least horsepower was back up to around 145, and mileage to roughly 25. By the end of the 80s, things were starting to shift back in the other direction. Wheelbase and height were up an inch, and weight more than 200 pounds. The V6 was the norm, and up to 195 cubic inches, or 3.2 liters, and 175 horsepower, although mileage was back down in the low 20s, and prices to above $20,000. Imports would start outselling domestics in many markets by the mid-90s, and the mid-size offering got bigger. Wheelbase 106 inches, Overall length 185, width 71, and height 57, and weight 3,300 pounds. The median 6 was now up to 3.5 liters again, and 205 horsepower, getting about 20 miles to the gallon, with prices nearing $30,000. The turn of the century saw 1-inch longer cars on 3-inch longer wheelbases, and gaining another inch in height and width, while up to 220 horsepower from 3.6 liters in a 3,500-pound car for only $34,000. Afterwards, size would not change much for a while. Prices would go up slightly to near $38,000, and weight would also go up slightly by about 100 pounds. Engines would get slightly smaller, back to 3.5 liters, but horsepower was up to around 270, while mileage dropped back into the high teens. With fewer manufacturers at the end of 2010, engines would get slightly smaller, dropping as low as 3.2 liters, but horsepower was up to around 280, and mileage was back in the low 20s. Although people were more often opting for the base engine, which was closer to a 2.5-liter four-cylinder with around 185 horsepower. Wheelbase was once again above 110 inches, and length above 190. But soon, although most big cars were gone, cars overall were bigger. Wheelbase just over 115 inches, and length just over 195, a trend that started to shift as the decade came to an end, and many models were being canceled without replacement. These days, average purchase price is more than $45,000, and the median base price closer to $50,000. Wheelbase is back down to around 110, length 186, width up to 73 inches, and height having climbed to 57 inches. Engine size is down to a 2.5-liter turbo with horsepower up as high as 300, and in spite of weight being around 3,600 pounds, mileage has climbed into the low to mid-30s, with the help of electrics and hybrids padding the numbers. Although again, this is different from the average, which is closer to a relatively tiny 2-liter turbo inline-4 with 200 horsepower. And it doesn't factor in SUVs, pickups, or minivans. If it did, surprisingly, prices wouldn't be much different. Wheelbase, length, and width would all be up about 2 inches, but then things would really start to change. With height up 6 inches, less than half due to ground clearance, and weight would be up 400 pounds, while losing about 6 miles per gallon from a similar engine. And that isn't a comparison of the middle-of-the-road car to the middle-of-the-road SUV. This is simply adding light trucks to the mix. If we were to compare cars to SUVs, the SUV would be about $1,000 more, a couple of inches bigger overall, 10 inches taller, 700 pounds heavier, with 5 fewer horsepower from a slightly bigger engine, and getting almost 10 fewer miles to the gallon. But with even more car models disappearing every year, it is getting harder to identify any trend not related to SUVs. Presuming there are still cars to talk about, we hope to see you in our next video. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.